Greetings in the name of the Most High. Hello. Today is it's kind of unwittingly, a dealing with the case of Brian Wilson, who just passed. I know there's so much news going on with Iran and the controlled, planned riots and the just the Mickey Mouse Club of absurdity that the world has become. But I think it's important to note that, he had died, um, and I think people, even in his death, it just seemed like he didn't really get the acknowledgement that he should have for his particular genius, which, and I know everybody has an excuse for Brian and his, but let me try to take a stab at it from my point of view, which is not a psychiatrist. I'm just analyzing and drawing some parallels to. I like to draw a parallel to Elon Musk, for example, and just say, well, look, imagine if Elon Musk didn't have the love of his mother and father, and everyone was telling him to conform. You know what I mean? Can you put the genie back in the bottle? Act like everybody else. What's wrong with you? Blend in. You're getting weird. You're weird. And that's how he was treated. But he wasn't treated. He was nurtured. And of course, the gifts that came forth were the maturation of his own genius, which is far above and beyond far beyond human. Okay, far beyond the average, I guess, the average human intelligence scale. And so, good thing, because there's a lot of things that he can do, that he will do, I'm sure, that will be beneficial to humanity. But more importantly, he was protected. Okay, something Brian Wilson was not. And so let me just try to go from broad to more minor. First of all, the music business is a really sleazy business, and the people in it will all tell you that. It's probably good if you're a session player. You went to Juilliard to play, violin or something, and you just show up at your sessions and then pay your rent and go to the beach or whatever. I don't know. But it's first of all, there's this very a lot of people are talking about they're going to do their next record, and they're going to and they'll do some kind of record and it flops, and it's just a it's almost impossible to get something done. But in the case of Brian Wilson, there's a certain genius he had that comes from being like a child. And I don't think it's any mystery that I'm gonna go there. Okay, so we're going right to the man-child situation. Now, what I used to say about Brian Wilson was that what it appeared like to me was he was simply a man-child that they had to break. They had to force him to grow up, and that's what a lot of the people that are around him did not understand. That they didn't understand him at all, and in fact, they shouldn't have even been around him. They're terrible people, and beginning, of course, with his father, and his father kind of doing watered down Brian stuff to try to make a buck off Brian's genius, when Brian was trying to move beyond. He was trying to move beyond where he was as a musician. Much to the consternation of the band that was constantly trying to hold him back, constantly trying to get him to go back to with the formula that worked, where they had their big hit, and that constant tug, which eventually he was introduced to drugs and different things, and he got into some He had reported that he had heard voices, and so people attached to him the paranoid schizophrenic aspect, that mental illness to his personality because of that. And I can understand that. I'm not even quibbling about that. But that place where he would hear things in his head is the same place where he would hear harmonies and melodies and counter melodies and arrangements in his head as well. So this may just be the sadness of humanity to be intolerant of Brian. The world is intolerant of Brian Wilson because of the fact that he wasn't some kind of Hollywood sleazeball. He was a pure-hearted, like a child, an innocent child. And of course, that led him into more and more drugs and more and more exploration into his consciousness. And he was desperately trying, it seemed to me, to break into, especially that period that now is the fact I was in the 8th grade, I think, when the Beach Boys were very familiar with the Beatles, and that they felt that the Beatles were direct competition, and they felt, well, we've got to do something. We can't let them pass us up. So what I don't think they understood was the only way they could get into that Beatles vibe that was influencing them so much, that was beckoning them, that was saying that this is the future, is that it had to go dark, because the Beatles came out of darkness and the Beach Boys came out of light. Well, regardless of whatever their religious beliefs or, I'm not even talking about that. I'm just talking about like a vibe, a space they were coming from. And so it would be impossible for the Beach Boys to really do some of this stuff. But Brian wanted to push on into what the Beatles were writing about. And he was still writing about, um, you know, uh, condescending view towards surf music, or just more progressive music, progressive lyrics that were kind of tugging at the reality of this world. And the brothers hated it, and the father, wrote it off and laughed in his face. And at the time, he had a psychiatrist appointed to him that eventually became his guardian, a guy with I'm not even sure he had really credentials as a psychiatrist, but his name was Eugene Landy, and his son Evan, who is also, I would say, just equally as inept as his father in terms of just being unable to comprehend what he was dealing with. Really, I mean, I wouldn't, with him, the son was not training as a psychiatrist. You can't blame the son, but I'm just saying, the two of them working on Brian Wilson 24/7 to try to get him to be normal, to lose the weight he gained in bed. Now, bed does not mean schizophrenic, nor it may not even mean depression. It is more attached to anger. Now, I knew a man who, well, we were roommates, and he was in the hospital because he was doing bed. I said, well, what do you do? I do bed. And he had a very domineering father, very similar to Brian Wilson, a very harsh father who wanted him to be in the military, like in the Citadel or into these high-end military college, and anything less, he would be a failure. So it wasn't for him. He was more of he was also a genius intellectually, and so he couldn't please his father, so he did bed for after a couple of years. His wife finally brought him to the hospital to say, well, what do we do about this? And the whole thing was revolving around anger and just stopping his life because of the fact that he wasn't allowed to have a life. If he didn't go to that Citadel, that's it. His life's over. Dad is not pleased. That's it. It's over. So there's my experience with someone that did bed. But I mean, I had a direct experience in the room, and every night we'd listen to Jazz in the Night. I remember from the local college there. And so we would really get into that, talk about jazz. Every night we just listened. And but anyway, so but I came to find that he was really probably the most angry person that I had ever known in my life, but also, tragically brilliant. Now he was not a man child. He was definitely a grown man, and subject to the forces of the world pulling him one way and another, dark to light, light to dark to light, all that confusion. He was not really a honcho, but he was not really one to be ordered about, you know. So they were trying to break him in the hospital, trying to, um, ju- just trying to break him, and feeling that the bed really, in a sense, was a way of his trying to hold on to childhood and not grow up. And so it's interesting how I knew that. And then as I see, and I've just perused Brian Wilson's life. I haven't, delved into, I'm not a historian here, but I'd always been amazed. Like I remember when he got quite heavy, and he was not invisible. He was around. There were pictures of him, and people would gasp at how much weight he'd gained, and that he looked like a child. He had the look in his face like a child, and I could tell what was going on, because you see, I'd been through this in certain circles. They don't look kindly. If you're a creative genius, that's fine, but if that means that you are some kind of a child genius, I guess, like a Mozart, you know what I mean, like a they wouldn't allow him to be that. They wanted him to grow up. And the problem with so they put a big regimen on him. They put a psychiatrist on him 24/7, and if he wasn't there, then his son was there to play with him, like having a schoolmate to play with. And who was also, I would say, both of these men, from what I understood about them, were both lightweights in understanding of human consciousness and humanity in itself, even human history or anything to deal with humanity. I don't even know why they would even be in this world, except they were being paid, $500,000 a year, and they wormed their way into the estate, into being named in the will, and also got to get a piece of the record business. So they're trying to get Brian to write music because they were getting a piece of it. And so everything, I guess, that this Landy family ended up having, really somehow it came from, you know, misunderstanding and not helping and doing harm to Brian Wilson. And then he met the current wife, Melinda, and they had, I think, 5 children. Seven children, but I mean, he had 2 children. I think then added 5.
Oh, I see.
And she named them all with a D, like Dakota, names like that. And she uncovered that problem, the the sort of immoral illegality of being named in the will and being the psychiatrist and being the guardian, responsible for everything that Brian Wilson would do. They would do, so they would starve him out of being fat, and they would try to restrict him from drugs and watch him so he didn't burn himself down because he would smoke in bed and things like that. And so they're hanging on at they're getting rich off it. See, that's the thing. No, I know this is probably, I know no one in Hollywood wants to deal with this subject. I understand that. And every time you people see Brian Wilson, you all become embarrassed, you become hurt, you become upset at seeing him, almost as if you had something to do with the way he turned out, which was, well, I wouldn't say completely miserable, having all these kids and having a wife that he loved, and she loved him, and she basically did have to call the shots because he was incapable of taking care of himself. She had to agree to take care of him. A lot of people think, well, that's a controlling, how is that different from the Landy psychiatrists that were trying to basically horn in on his music. But the bottom line is, while all this was going on, all this music is going on out in the world. He's being influenced, but he's being stifled at every turn, either by the band, by the whatever management, whatever. Eventually, they were able to kind of catch a little bit of that psychedelic vibe with Good Vibrations, and that went to #1. It was the biggest hit they had ever had, far bigger than Surf City or whatever it was. So Surfing in the USA or the rest of it. And so and wherever you see pictures in the society pages of Brian Wilson, they would always be, oh, so sad, so sad, so sad, so sad. Even one that I put up here, that I put the trailer to Love and Mercy, because because so many people objected to that because they felt that his wife really told the story and it was unfair to Eugene Landy. And I say it doesn't go far enough. It doesn't go far enough. You're dealing with a predator and a psychopath, posing as a psychiatrist. And they said, well, he did save his life. Yeah. Well, I went to the hospital. They did an operation on my lung. They saved my life, but then they gave me anemia. They gave me, COPD and a lot of other things that I didn't bargain for. But my life is saved. Great. This is the reason that people in Hollywood feel guilty. Now I'm going into the prophetic. Now, all this is not verifiable. This is my own take on just having seen what you've seen in the media. I'm not really qualified. I'm not Mr. Wilson's, biographer. That's not what's happening here. But I am acknowledging the fact we had a genius and destroyed that genius. The very music business that was needed, because the other Beach Boys were interchangeable. They didn't have the gift, and didn't even matter if they were there or not, except for the resonance and the harmonies and things like that, and the fact that Brian Wilson could work with them. But other than that, that's as far as their importance went. It's really not a collaborative effort. It's really all Brian Wilson's effort. And but there was never any acknowledgement of that. It was always, stop going to the refrigerator. Don't go over there. Don't talk to these people like that. Or in traveling, be nice. Go up in there, just like treating, humiliating treatment like a child. And then, like I said, when we saw pictures back in the 80s and 90s of Brian Wilson, everybody, seeing him quite obese, everyone was just so sad, so sad. Oh, and not realizing just how controlled he was. Well, eventually, he wanted to get together with Melinda, his wife, and she helped to get him away from the psychiatrists and from the handlers. And these psychiatrists were. What I liked about the film is at one point in the film, dialogue, some quite good dialogue in there. And one of the pieces of dialogue I really liked was when he goes, it was played by a guy that I know he's a nice guy, but man, you just want to deck him when you see him in this thing. And he plays the psychiatrist, Eugene Landy. And he goes, I'm the control. I can't believe they actually said that. They give it, this was a film that came out in 2015. I am the control. I am the control here. He can't even take a shit without my permission. And that was the answer to Breaking a Man-Child. And in Breaking a Man-Child, the genius of the music is gone. And then manifests, in my opinion, manifests in what looks like mental illness, but it's really just the equivalent of being tortured by people who have no fucking clue what they're doing. And it's sad to have watched it, to have seen that. And then I've seen the other documentaries and all the all the speculation and all the, social pages, just like you all have, here's Brian Wilson makes an appearance and then he's really obese and everyone's like, oh my God, or he's struggling with his words, or he looks kind of weird look on his face, and they're just, oh, but they all really just feel guilty. They just feel guilty. They did this. They can't have somebody like that walking around. What do they think of me? And I'm just a regular guy trying to do the music, and I'm like a hot little rock star going out here. And then we got to deal with this guy, Brian Wilson, who doesn't, he doesn't even know where he is half the time. What, lost in a childhood nursery rhyme? And are there other geniuses you can think of? Have you ever heard the name Van Gogh, Van Gogh? Or Beethoven? Or anyone? And then you hear about, there was a time when I was writing Glass Backwards, which, we don't know if it's a good novel or not. We don't have anyone who really reviewed it or anything. It's, just my going out there to the cold crew world and saying, here's something I wrote, and the world saying, fuck you, shove it up your ass. So, which is the typical thing they do with everything you create. So don't feel bad about that. But I remember, it was very inspired writing at times, very inspired. And I was getting a lot of the words and the dialogue and the scenes walking up and down the halls. I remember we had gone for a weekend at the in Rancho Mirage, and I was walking up and down the hall. I think it was they were going to have a martini night or something. I'd already been drinking, and I was wandering up and down the hall talking to myself, playing these scenes out. And then I did the same thing in the pool to the extent where people were looking at me like, what is wrong with this guy? And I was just lost in the narrative. And, if they could have, I'm sure that if there were people who could have gotten closer to me, they would have tried to shut me up, stuff it back down, start acting like an adult, quit acting like a child. Now, a man-child is a man-child. I mean, it's like, it's not something you can fake, going back and forth between a man and a child. It's you just have I think the Bible also refers to these as pure hearts. And they're to be cherished, not to be bullied, not to be bludgeoned into being an adult, forced into thinking right and behaving right, and in so doing, destroying the gift. And then as far as feeling guilty when you see Mr. Brian Wilson appear, well, you don't have to worry about that anymore, Holly fuck. You don't have to worry about that anymore. He's not going to bother you anymore. But the worst thing that I ever saw, and I'm going to leave it here, is when finally Brian Wilson takes the stage with all the diversity of all those musicians. And boy, they're all geniuses, aren't they? And there he is on the stage. And so he decides to do a tune for the music, blah, 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 bullshit, Hollywood Music Association or whatever it is, the Grammys, let's say, or some other, bullshit thing. And he goes, he starts strumming the guitar, and then it's like, my sweet Lord, Holland. He starts singing My Sweet Lord, George Harrison's tribute to Krishna. And basically, everyone on the stage is nodding at him like, yeah, you're one of us now. You've come back to us now. You're a grown man now. You're worthy of respect now. And there was... No, it was tragic. Seeing the death of Brian Wilson. I saw the death of Brian Wilson on that. I don't know whether it was the Grammys or what it was, but whatever I saw, singing "My Sweet Lord," it's out on the, you can find it, a clip out there. It was the ultimate capitulation. That's where Brian Wilson had completely, finally, I guess, given up. Now I know he liked the Beatles, and I know he wasn't against groups that he liked. He wasn't like blocking their music out because of an ego problem, but he was like, he was all for his own ego at one point too. But you'd think that they would have left you with, even the music industry, even the media couldn't leave him doing a song that he came up with that was genius. They had to have him bowing down to that. And I'm not saying it's not a catchy tune. It's, everybody hums it in their head when they hear it. I don't, I know what it's about, so I'm, basically not really into Krishna right at the moment, so I'm not really gonna go there. And it's fine. Let people do whatever they're gonna do musically. But like I said, the fact they didn't go out on his own song and they didn't celebrate that. They only celebrated him if he bowed his knee down. And I think that's the way he was treated by this world. And that's why he did bed. And that's why he did drugs. And that's why he got fat. And that's why he attracted the psychiatrist to lock him up and steal his money, which is what they did. And but he had a pretty happy ending, at least with his wife took care of him, and they were able to have several children, and that's always, light, and that was goodness. So it wasn't a complete loss, but the idea that they just wouldn't let him be himself, because he made people feel guilty when he would show up in his condition. It's like each one of them had a little part in hurting and destroying Brian Wilson. And that's my poetic takeaway. Not really a review, but just a lament. I went back and found Love and Mercy because I saw this film several years ago, and I saw in the Daily Mail the complaint of one of, I guess, Landy's, the psychiatrist's son, was complaining that, that's not really what it was about. That was distorted. That was the wife guiding the whole thing, all lies. My father was a good man and all that. And it's like, no. I'm sorry, you're wrong about that. And it's unbelievable. It's unbelievable what people can get away with. That you can destroy somebody's soul and just walk away without even the slightest, raised eyebrow. Way to go, America. You guys rock. So we'll see you. And I'm not really a fan of the Beach Boy music, except I was kind of a fan of the later music, where he was trying to bust out of that Beach Boy thing and go a little darker. And I was wanting more of that, but I guess somebody cut him off at the knees. Oh, well, my sweet Lord, hallelujah. There you go. Maybe they could project that over your grave when they do the ceremony. I'll see you next time.
You wanna go on the ride for the rest of the time. Now you're pulling in to San Bernardino. secret place they call